friends, and welcome to the Non-Diet Yogi podcast. I am your host, Casey Conroy, non-diet dietitian, final year naturopath student, hurrah, and yoga teacher. And this is episode 33, Buddhism and Intuitive Eating with Jenna Hollenstein. I wanted to start off by saying, hello, it's been a minute. And before I get into today's interview, I wanted to give you a brief update on where I've been in the last few months, because you might have noticed this podcast has been a little bit quiet of late. I haven't been producing regular podcasts at all. I think my last one was put out in September, a couple of months ago. And you know what? I'm noticing that this podcast and I have a rhythm. I'm starting to understand why many podcasts have seasons. It's so that there is a defined, delineated break in production, which I suppose allows space for humanity, because I am a human. Funnily enough, when I listen to podcasts, sometimes I forget that about some of the amazing podcasters I hear. It's like, wow, these guys are absolute production machines, and they just consistently put out episodes. I've realized I cannot do that, at least not as a one-woman show. So some of you might know I was partway through my Moontime Nutrition series, which was all about nourishing the different phases of one's menstrual cycle, if you happen to have a menstrual cycle. And so I just wanted to let you know I do intend on continuing with that into the new year. And the 2 episodes I've released so far, episodes 31 and 32, have received more downloads than average, I'll say. So I know you lovely listeners out there are curious about that subject matter, and I will continue with those into the new year. So in the last few months, I've moved house, I've moved my clinic space, I've really ramped up my study load so that after 8 years of studying this degree whilst having babies, etc., I can finally finish this naturopathy degree, and I'm currently studying full-time. Most of it is completing practical hours at Student Clinic in Brisbane, which, since I live on the Sunshine Coast hinterlands, means about 4 hours of commuting per day for a couple of days per week. And I'm running my clinic space in Maloney, and I'm parenting 2 little kids. And up until recently, I was also teaching regular yoga classes. And as you might be able to tell, I was freaking exhausted. So eventually I stopped teaching yoga, which was hard. But I did it, and that was the correct decision to make. And I know I'll be starting up classes again when I have finished studying and life becomes a little more manageable again. I've also had a few family crises, a few unforeseen dilemmas thrown in for good measure. And so I've realized and seen yet again that burnout and I have this on and off relationship. It can kind of sneak up on me, and each time it does, I think I'm getting better at catching it before it really burns me to an absolute crisp, Game of Thrones kind of style. But you know, healthy balance and self-care are things I'm still very much figuring out right alongside my clients. So luckily I caught it pretty early this time, hence stepping down from teaching yoga. But with everything else going on, the podcast and other fun things like writing and art and all those beautiful things that I love to do when I'm not exhausted, those are usually the first things to go for me, hence my absence. So I think you get the drift. This interview, however, with Jenna is something that we lined up many months ago, and it was always going to happen. And I feel so lucky that I finally got to meet and speak with Jenna. Jenna Hollenstein, she's an incredible practitioner and human being, and we share many professional spaces, which I mentioned at the start of our chat. Her most recent book is absolutely beautiful. I was very kindly offered an ebook version of her book, which I used to research for this interview. But it's such an incredible book that I know I'm going to be referring to it again and again in the future and recommending it to clients. So I will be ordering a hard copy to have on hand. It's an absolute treasure trove of wisdom, of body compassion and kindness, much like Jenna. So about Jenna Hollenstein is an anti-diet dietitian and meditation teacher who helps people struggling with chronic dieting, disordered eating, and body image. She uses a combination of intuitive eating, meditation, trauma sensitive mindfulness, and somatic modalities, including polyvagal theory, ooh, I love it, to help her clients move toward greater peace, health, and wellness. Jenna is a registered dietitian nutritionist and a certified dietitian nutritionist in New York State. She has a bachelor's degree in nutrition from Penn State, a master's degree in nutrition from Tufts University, and is a certified intuitive eating counselor. Jenna has been featured in Forbes, Wall Street Journal, US News and World Report, Health, Lion's Roar, Mindful, Vogue, Elle, Glamour, Women's World, and Fox News. Jenna is the author of Eat to Love, a mindful guide to transforming your relationship with food, body, and life, and Mummy Sattva. I never pronounced that properly because I am Australian, not American. Mommy Sattva, Contemplations for Mothers Who Meditate or Wish They Could. And her new book, which is the one we're discussing in this interview, is called Intuitive Eating for Life, How Mindfulness Can Deepen and Sustain Your Intuitive Eating Practice. Before we get into the interview, I just want to let you know that I am currently taking on new clients on a very limited basis while I complete the very last 6 months of my naturopathy degree. Despite currently being a full-time student, I have been a nutritionist and non-diet dietitian for 10 years, and my own clinic continues to roll along. So I've just opened my clinic just a couple of months ago now up in Maleny, the Sunshine Coast hinterlands of Queensland, Australia, and I also work virtually. I love working one-on-one with people, really getting to know them as a person so that I can help them from a really holistic and health at every size aligned way that respects people's bodies, respects where they're at in their lives, basically. I specialize in women's health, metabolic and hormonal imbalances, eating disorders, disordered eating, especially orthorexia, which I've personally experienced and fully recovered from about 10 plus years ago, weight and body image concerns, and basically all things kind of iffy about relationships with food and body. I see clients in my private clinic in Maleny, as I mentioned, and virtually. So whether you're a Zoomer, a phone person, Skype, whatever, I can do all of those. And since I'm an accredited practicing dietitian, Medicare and private health fund rebates are available, and I also offer packages so you can get the support you need at a reduced rate. Finally, if you love this podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple iTunes. To do so is dead easy. From the show page, you just scroll down until you see the rating and review section with the 5 stars. And for even more awesomeness, you can become a Patreon of the podcast for $2 a month and receive non-diet yogi bonuses in addition to loads of other goodies. There's a bunch of bonuses from past guests up there. Yoga classes. There's a bunch of stuff there. Anyway, let's settle in, grab a cup of whatever beverage you wish to have, no judgment here, and let's listen to this wonderful conversation with Jenna Hollenstein. Hello, Jenna, and thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor and an exciting pleasure to finally meet you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yay. So Jen, I'll let you know, I first heard about you on David Nickturn's podcast about another one of your books, The Way of the Mummy Sattva, or Mommy Sattva, as you guys say it. And you spoke about the ways that mothers so often become involuntary mummy sattvas and dedicate our lives to the benefiting of others, to our children, and how that spiritual practice we have as women can really shift so drastically after having kids. And I was listening to it, and I can't remember at which stage I found out, oh, she's also a dietitian. And oh, she's also an intuitive eating dietitian. And all these lights just kind of went off in my head, and I couldn't believe that that was the first time I was hearing from you. And I later on went and stalked you and sifted through all our, connecting friends and colleagues, and realized, like, oh my God, we have so many colleagues and people in common. I was bound to bump into you eventually. So yay.
I'm so glad that you did. That is so funny that we connected that way.
Yeah, yeah. So before I dive into your new book, very exciting and upcoming, I'd love for the listeners to get to know you a little bit, and I want to get to know you too. So one of the first things that struck me as I researched this episode, and looked at your website and your offerings and what you've written, is your honesty, actually, and just how incredibly kind of transparent you are about a lot of things, about the fact that you live with depression and anxiety, which you say, I'm going to quote you a few times if that's okay. You say, they're common mental illnesses I feel compelled to destigmatize, which is wonderful. About chronic pain, how you live with that as well. You're really upfront about your lived experiences, with disordered eating and drinking. And it's wonderful and refreshing to see not only your willingness to be open about that, but your accompanying wish to destigmatize these very, very common mental health issues. So I'm wondering, was it through these experiences that you came to Buddhism? Like, how did you get here? That's my way of asking that.
Yeah. Well, there was definitely a connection between recovery from alcohol and Buddhism. I had been reading some books by Pema Chodron around that time. A friend recommended them to me, but I wasn't yet meditating. And then at some point, about a year after I stopped drinking, I actually put my butt on a cushion, and you use the phrase brain exploding with connections, and my brain started exploding with connections. But I'm sure it started before then. I mean, I was just talking to a client about how our narratives and how we tell our stories change, over time. And this was we're recording this right after American Thanksgiving. And I noticed today, for example, a desire to kind of go back in time with my sister and sort of understand what it was like for her, as a teenager growing up in our house. And so there's just a part of me that realizes that the way that we process ourselves and our stories and our connections that we make is always shifting. And maybe it's in certain movements that the realization occurs to us, but it's constantly shifting, And so my feeling just being asked this question in this moment was that I think I might have always been Buddhist. And I think that I was just not exposed to those people and not exposed to the teachings of the normality of suffering, and that it's not avoiding suffering that's the goal, but working with, being with, allowing, feeling. I think those things probably would have made sense to me a lot earlier than 33, 34, had I been exposed to them.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think it's when you came across a formal kind of framework, hence the brain exploding, because it was already kind of there, but just not in
Exactly.
that so clearly delineated.
I think so. I
Hmm.
don't know. I don't know. I mean, we're not the greatest historians of ourselves, are we?
No,
You
that's so
know,
true. But it's really interesting the way that you put that. I can kind of relate to some of that myself. I really like how you've just brought up something so intrinsic to Buddhism. I have Buddhist leanings. I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist, but I definitely dabble and have done so for years. But one thing you mentioned was this theme of suffering and the inevitability of it that Buddhism so, puts down in a really strong, big way, and how there's a lot of working with reality, which involves a great deal of discomfort, right? And in
yeah,
Buddhism, so much emphasis is placed on that inevitability of suffering. I suppose discomfort's another way to describe it. So I guess moving into what we're going to talk about today and the intuitive eating stuff, if I can ask, how do we tolerate the discomfort that so often arises in our journey into intuitive eating? Um, you know, I'm just thinking of the last two clients I saw who, one of them, we're just introducing this concept of unconditional permission to eat. And, for someone who is invited suddenly to allow herself to eat foods that she's been scared of for years or even decades, this can bring up a lot of fear, obviously. So, how does one start to make peace with food and challenge food rules that may seem just so second nature?
yeah, yeah. I think that, we're biological beings, and in order to encounter suffering and not scram immediately, we probably do need a certain amount of just biological stability, right? And I think that's what keeps a lot of us in that very shaky space for a long time, is that when we're dieting, we're not biologically stable. We can't do the deep emotional and mental work that intuitive eating requires when our basic physiologic needs are unmet. And so I do think that the topic of discomfort and these sort of like ways in which we turn everything that we know on its head in an anti-diet approach, the only way we can really do that is by simultaneously making sure we're eating enough and sleeping enough and addressing stress and trauma and you know ensuring that our just basic human needs are being tended to, and also acknowledging that different individuals have a different tolerance for discomfort. We're not all wired the same exact way. Some of us experience a certain situation as subjectively much more uncomfortable than somebody else will, and that has a lot of different factors influencing it. So when we're dealing with discomfort and we're even just having the conversation about discomfort, I think it's so important to reinforce the idea of being right where you are. Like, yeah, you want to be in a different place, but you can't, I always say you can't heal aggression with aggression, right? So you can't force yourself into discomfort, but you can start to stabilize the body You can start to contemplate these issues around discomfort. You can start to see the things that bring up, a lot of angst and discomfort for you, and make space for them, sort of without really determining where you want to go with that just yet. Because I trust in that basic goodness of the body, that basic intelligence of the heart, mind, that takes care of a lot when you give it space and support. But in so many of our cultures, we think we need to drive the process. I'm over here and I want to get over there, and this is what I'm going to do to accomplish that, rather than really letting ourselves be where we are, because we're here for a reason. We get to this point for a reason, based on the different circumstances in our lives, our genetics, our intergenerational trauma, and things like that. Just acknowledging that and making space for it actually allows that process to unfold, I think, a lot more organically, a lot more naturally, a lot more authentically than if we're forcing it or manhandling it.
You've brought up two really juicy topics there. First, it was about ensuring our basic human biological needs are met in order to do that deeper emotional and mental rewiring, which is so important. And also this thing that I love about the way you merge mindfulness with intuitive eating, and just the way you approach mindfulness, full stop, because I'm sure, well, maybe you feel the same as me, but I feel like mindfulness has been a bit co-opted these days, and it's often used as another technique for self-improvement, another way to increase productivity, right? And one of the core themes I noticed that you weave right throughout your beautiful book is this concept of mindfulness not as self-improvement, but you present it in its original form as the way Buddhism presents it, in that its purpose is to be with yourself just as you are, not to self-improve. And I really love in particular the way you marry that basic tenet of Buddhist philosophy with one very important intuitive eating principle, and that is making peace with food. So are you able to dive in a little bit and tell us what, kind of describe the difference between doing this, walking this intuitive path, doing that as work and as self-improvement, versus doing it as self-care and taking that approach of being with yourself just as you are? What does that look like?
It's so hard, because we can't help but look at new things through old lenses, right? So we can't help but look at intuitive eating through a dieting lens. We can't help but look at a practice like mindfulness through a sort of productivity lens, and in fact, I even said the words militant mindfulness earlier today in regards to just what you're talking about, this idea of using mindfulness for a specific outcome, which is a very Western idea. I remember when I was living in the city, seeing a billboard at a bus stop that said something like, "I meditate to crush it at work." And I'm like, oh my God, it was like a dagger through my heart. You know what I mean?
It was.
And, it's such a sad misinterpretation of mindfulness, which I agree is to be with. But I think some of the roots of this misinterpretation are the belief that we're not okay as we are, and that being human is something to transcend, you know? And so, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and there was a certain framework that I understood from that, you know, those formative years of like, you're sort of born a sinner, and your life is an opportunity to repent for that inevitable quality, and to endure suffering in a sense through like selflessness and other orientation, asceticism, all these different things in order to reap a reward in the afterlife. That's sort of a grand oversimplification. You know, there's a lot of things about every religion that I think are quite beautiful. And I think religions at their heart are meant to be good. It's when they get organized, including Buddhism, it's when they get organized that things start to go left. But my early exposure to Buddhism was such a direct contrast to that was like, you're born good. That cannot be taken away from you. You don't need to earn it. Suffering is not something you endure so that you get a cookie at the end. Suffering is just part of life. And suffering exists on a huge spectrum. You know, I always say from like sickness, old age, and death, all the way to like bad takeout. You know, that's a form of suffering too, right? Disappointment, that kind of a thing. And so, you know, the idea that we're innately good, innately wise, puts us in a different place to make peace with food. You know, I think it just sort of positions us differently so that we're not needing to fight against anything. You know, I think that that perspective is also inviting of self-compassion. This idea like, oh, well, when I look at it this way, it makes sense that I'd be fighting with food, right? I was taught that I couldn't be trusted around certain foods. I was taught that I wouldn't choose to eat healthy foods if left to my own devices. I was taught that I wouldn't move my body if I was the one in charge, right? So I was sort of, you know, many of us were raised in this framework that the body's not to be trusted. And so you need to drive it. You need to overpower it. You need to tell it what to do. And when you recognize then that had you not been taught to fight with your body and to fight with food, perhaps things would be different. Then maybe a space opens up to contemplate, like, so what would my relationship with peanut butter cups be if I were allowed to like eat them at Halloween and maybe get a tummy ache and then decide when I wanted them and when I didn't want them after? You know, like maybe a space opens up to contemplate like, yeah, I don't really like running. It's sort of boring to me and it hurts my feet, but swimming is so enjoyable to me that I will do it in the middle of the winter, you know? And so there's a basic trust and confidence in that like internal compass, you know? And I think that when you have that trust in the internal compass, then, and you understand that suffering is just a part of life, then it's not like you're playing to win. It's not like you're playing a game and the goal is to avoid suffering. Suffering becomes integrated in every aspect of life, just as pleasure becomes integrated into every aspect of life. And you get to realize like, oh, this is something that's difficult for me. This is something that feels really good for me. You know, this is a food that I seem to be able to make peace with right now. This is a food that still feels tricky. What's going on there? You know? So that juxtaposition of like discomfort and pleasure in the context of basic goodness really seems to help make peace with food. And just to add to that, I'm sorry, I'm like answering your questions with like these long things, but I recently was sort of thinking about the intuitive eating process because just, you know, practicing in this field for many years and looking at how it happens in real life as opposed to sort of like the numbered 1 to 10 principles, it occurred to me that intuitive eating can be seen as like an ecosystem with like a tree planted in the soil that receives like nutrients from the soil and sunshine and rain and carbon dioxide. I guess I didn't account for carbon dioxide, but I see the soil as honoring your hunger and practicing body respect, the trunk as satisfaction, you know, which Evelyn and Elise put at the center of the mandala as of the 3rd edition of the book. And then where the branches start to come off, that's where peace with food really happens. It's in meeting those basic needs of hunger, committing to taking care of your body no matter how you feel about it, and prioritizing satisfaction, that peace with food really seems to grow.
Yeah.
You know?
I love that analogy. That's a really nice way of putting it all together. And I guess coming back to the soil, the foundations, and that importance of eating enough and of connecting to hunger. I think that's something I spend a considerable amount of time discussing with many of my clients, as many non-dietitians will probably, you know, can relate to. And I really appreciate how much you emphasize the importance of eating enough before getting into those deeper emotional aspects of one's relationship with food and body. And I do, if I can quote you again, in your book, you say that connecting with hunger is the entry point to true embodiment. Can you speak a little to the importance of connecting to hunger and why it underpins intuitive eating? That's an amazing statement.
I love that. I love that honor your hunger obviously comes so, you know, early in the process, in the principles. And, you know, as you know, so many people come to us because they think they're overeating. And it's like this real point of confusion when we, as the clinician, emphasize eating enough, right? Because somewhere in the process, something got distorted, right? Even if the difficulty that you're experiencing, the primary difficulty you're experiencing is overeating, according to your definition of overeating, somewhere in there, your needs are not being met. Whether it's across the board, whether it's at certain times of the day, whether it's during a significant period of your life, that's happening, you know? And so also, I think just having permission to eat when people kind of finally come to the intuitive eating process is a relief. And so connecting with those sensations of hunger can feel more concrete for a lot of people, certainly a little less complicated for many people than sensations of fullness, right? In that like tree image that I imagine, fullness is like up there with movement and nutrition in the foliage.
Mm.
You know, those are like the advanced practices, fullness, movement, and nutrition. They have to come a little later. And working with hunger, though, it seems like, you know, just even recognizing how hunger shows up in your unique body, for many people, is like this reminder of how to feel. You know, I think of meditation as a reminder of how to feel. You know, the practice that I do is called shamatha, and it's a practice in which you feel your breath, you know, because the mind's awareness that you're breathing brings the mind and the body into the same place at the same moment, right? So it's this like reminder, like, oh, right, I'm this feeling being. I have this body. And hunger is similar in that way. It's this like, oh, right, I have this thing. And there was a time when this was uncomplicated, right? I always think of hunger as like one of the first ways that we experience care, one of the first ways that we experience the idea of enough, you know, and also one of the first ways in which we individuate. And we say, you know, this is my body, not your body. And so starting with hunger is such a lovely way of starting to take back the autonomy that we outsource to the supposed gurus and influencers. That really does create the foundation for the whole practice, you know?
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned that for different people, hunger is registered in different ways. And that makes me think of interoception, right? And that's a word that you mention again throughout the book in relation to our to the way we eat and relationship to our bodies. And obviously it gets a lot of airtime in yoga and movement kind of spaces. But in your words, Jenna, what is interoception, if you could describe it to the listeners, including people who might not have heard that word before? And how does it relate to intuitive eating? How, sorry, it's probably like 3 questions. And how do we strengthen those interoceptive muscles?
I'm really bad at multi-part questions, so you might have to remind me.
Yeah,
But,
that's fine.
and I'm sure this is not my words, right? Like I'm really sensitive to like, I like to call it mindfulness, you know, like that kind of a thing. Like I'm sure that somebody else came up with this definition and I'm just like stealing it like an artist. But I think of interoception as the capacity to sense and interpret in real time what's happening in the body, right? To make unconscious perception conscious. And so that can happen obviously with hunger, that can happen with emotion, that can happen with pain, that can happen with sleepiness, all of those different things. What was the second part to your question?
No, perfect. No worries. How does interoception relate to intuitive eating?
So, right. Interoception is like the axis of intuitive eating, right? And I think it has to do with the internal versus external question. Because with dieting, we're always thinking about the external things that tell us what and when and how much to eat and move and whatever. What we forget is that we have this like natural built-in self-regulation that we perceive through interoception that alleviates any need to measure food, count calories. You know, that external knowledge can be complementary, but it should never override our interoception, you know? And so I think I heard the concept of shifting allegiance in a Pema Chodron book. And I love to think of intuitive eating as a shifting of allegiance from external expertise and certainty to an internal somatic, not always certain, it's like a certain enough knowing, you know, and that's helpful. And I think it goes in line with that taking back, that reclaiming autonomy, that reclaiming a sense of expertise toward your own body, you know?
Yeah. So the third part was, how do we strengthen our interoceptive capacities? Maybe if we've lost touch with that after years of dieting, or, you know.
Right. Well, I have two answers to that. One is very practical, and that is to ensure that our basic needs are being met again, right? Because it's very difficult to sense and interpret when we're in fight or flight mode, when our bodies don't feel safe, and our bodies don't feel safe when we're underfed, right? So in order to connect with interoception, if you're not yet ready to connect in a clear way with hunger signals, you might have to use some form of structured eating as like almost like an overlay or like a scaffolding that frames your day as a way to invite back out the sensations that you can then sense and interpret and ultimately respond to. But the other answer is meditation. A meditation that in which the object, right? If meditation is defined as substituting for your discursive mind another object of attention, if the object is a sensation where you're feeling, then that will train you to home in on what's going on in your body, you know? Like right now, talking to you, because I get excited about this stuff, and I still have like my pediatric stage fright that I've always suffered from. Has tormented me my whole life. I can feel this like these sensations of almost like breathlessness and a sort of like vibration in my body and things like that. And I can't tell you how many years I didn't even realize what was going on. I just knew like I am really uncomfortable and I would really like a drink. That's all I knew. So, you know, through meditation, I'm able to be aware of what's happening kind of in a moment to moment, not in a heavy handed way, in a really kind of light way, but moment to moment awareness in the body. And then also being able to ride it, you know, not being able to, not having to try to take away or add on to something, but just being able to be with it, you know, as you said, about being about being with. So meditation, feeling, you're literally like, it's like a gym for interoception. You're training to feel. You're reconnecting with feeling.
I think you give a lot of opportunities to train throughout your book. I really love the mindful moments throughout your book. When I went through it, it felt like I was being given very frequent, loving opportunities to slow down, to take notice, to put things into practice. And your questions are written in a way that really pulled me into the present moment. So I found, you know, I'd go to my computer and go like, okay, I got to read this book and I got to come up with some clever questions to ask Jenna. But then as I was practicing and doing some of the, you know, mindful moment things that you suggested, even the questions that you asked were just like, oh, that seems so delicious to do, or that seems so curious, I want to try that. Couple of your questions I noted were, you know, what is the texture of my thoughts right now? That question even though it's a, it is a thought related question, it asks you to go a bit deeper than what are your thoughts? What's the texture of it? How does it feel to have those thoughts right now? What in my environment might be affecting me is another one that you asked. And the meditations are just beautiful that you've got in your book. I think there was a mindful moment on Everyday Magic, which was my favorite. And I'm wondering, do you frequently use meditations, whether they're Buddhist inspired or just ones you've come up with? Do you use those tools a lot with your clients in dietetic practice, and how do people respond to those?
I do. It's so funny. I have such a strong reaction to the word meditations sometimes, because so often meditations are done with a very specific objective, as opposed to meditation, which is sort of done as a practice, sort of like brushing your teeth. It's like very boring. And if it's boring, that's a good sign, without a goal. Like nobody, what did I say the other day to my family? I was like, nobody becomes Buddhist because everything is awesome, right? Nobody starts meditating because everything is awesome. We all come to it with a goal. We want to be calmer. We want to be able to like not get triggered at Thanksgiving, but whatever we get from it is usually very different from what we go into it hoping for. But I do use mindful exercises that are based on my own sort of understanding of what's going on in meditation, what's the point of it all. Frequently in what I write, what I talk about with people, what I give for homework, what I've been doing a couple of groups on like fullness or body image. So it's all about those experiments, and creating space, and also probably acknowledging that we are emotional beings and that there's nothing wrong with that. And that goes way back for me to, being the little kid that was like always told that she was too sensitive and you're overreacting and just get over it, just, snap out of it kind of a thing. And I guess I really want to normalize emotion, and that we have feelings about everything. I think that everything that happens is emotional. Like why you buy this glass instead of that glass is emotional, And so I think I've forgotten your original question. But I just keep coming back to this, the feeling part of it, and how important that is when we're contemplating these aspects of our relationship with food and our bodies. We have to make space for the emotion. And so the meditations, the language, the exercises, the experiments, all should take into account the emotional being that we are.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of that. They do.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Shifting gears just a little bit, Jenna. You've mentioned this, I think, earlier in the podcast, but can we talk about pleasure for a moment? I can't remember which part of the book it was, but you had a list of ideas to help us be with our emotions. I think it was under the mindful soothing list, and you had sensuality. And I'll quote you again. You said, "This is a topic often left out of resources such as this one, but we are essentially sexual and sensual beings." And you seem to discuss pleasure openly and frankly in whatever form. I think you also quoted Audre Lorde, who describes pleasure not as self-indulgent, but as a meaningful spiritual practice that can be a benefit not only to the individual, but to everyone around us. Can you speak a bit about what makes pleasure so important? And maybe, yeah, I'll stop there. I won't do the triple question. What
Thank
makes
you.
pleasure so important?
Yeah. Well, we're hardwired for pleasure, right? One of the fascinating things to me as I was learning about Buddhism was this simultaneity of our hardwiring for pleasure and the fact that when we only pursue pleasure, we end up amplifying our suffering, right? And so in my own arc, my own like narrative, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have been much more focused on the importance of tolerating discomfort. But there's a really important part that I left out, and that is doing what kind of comes naturally to us, what makes us feel, I think, the most alive often, and that is pleasure, right? So the biological way in which food smells and tastes and looks the most appealing when we're physically hungry. Pleasure drives us to stay alive, right? The fact that, we exist probably has something to do with the fact that sex feels good.
Something.
Something to do with it, but I was acutely aware doing this work that food often became a stand-in for unmet sensual needs, and how difficult, myself included, a lot of us felt it was to inhabit and embody our sensuality, and I think that has to do with misinterpretations of pleasure in religious traditions, and other cultural traditions that make pleasure dangerous, and again, it's this sort of fighting against our humanness. And I am, realizing that it's so important to expand our understanding of what gives us pleasure. And yeah, it makes sense if you're like an overworked, sleep deprived, mom, for example, who doesn't have a whole lot of time left in the day to think about what helps her feel most alive, then the default becomes, I don't know, bonbons.
Yeah.
Like that's a sort of like very logical default, and they don't ask anything of you. Right. And so there's a privilege to being able to explore pleasure that involves having the time, having the ability to maybe expand beyond sort of traumatizing learnings that make pleasure pathological. Access, there are lots of barriers to pleasure, obviously. And I'm very touched by the work of like Audre Lorde and Adrienne Marie Brown, who really position pleasure as a practice, as a form of resistance, and as something that has a much bigger impact than just our personal pleasure. It actually affects how we show up in the world And that has an interdependent quality,
Mm.
you know? So just understanding ourselves as sensual beings, understanding the sort of primacy of sexuality in us, and that, you know, to not be afraid of it, but to understand that there are plenty of good reasons to be afraid of it, can again maybe create some space to explore, well, what gives me pleasure? What helps me feel like I'm in my life? You
Mm.
know, is it art? Is it music? Is it movement? Is it specific types of movement? Is it specific types of foods? I mean, one of I think the biggest tragedies of nutrition science has been to communicate to people that their traditional foods are unhealthy, and to, you know, separate people from their culture and their traditions and the things that help them feel connected with a lineage, you know? So connecting, you know, with those things with a sense of like, oh, this is actually really important for me to take back, you know, not just because of my personal pleasure, but because of like my whole tradition of pleasure in this way. I mean, that feels really important and true to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's that's quite profound to know that there is that connection between the pleasure we experience in our own bodies and these greater ripples, you know, the way that it ripples out from that. And it makes me think, this will be my last question before we just, you know, start to wrap up. But I suppose given that there is this entire diet culture, right? Not to mention, you know, what you touched on this just then, but that immensity of these certain social systems that erase, right? Culture, certain
Yeah.
cultures. All these forces, and there are many of them, but result in this hyper individuality and this hyper focus on the physical body and mass social, not social, mass body dysmorphia and body dissatisfaction. So for me, at least, sometimes it feels like these influences are so massive and almost omnipotent, like they're just invisible and they're everywhere. How do we move our focus away from the things that we're constantly told, you know, to focus on? So, for example, how we can change our bodies, how we can more, you know, follow the rules better, eat healthily in that narrow description of healthy eating. And how do we move more towards caring for our bodies? Yeah, I'll just put it that way, because as you just said, caring for our bodies and especially that pleasure principle has that ripple effect
Yeah.
to extend beyond us. So how do we shift that focus and change the allegiance, I think, as you referred to it?
Yeah. It's not easy because, you know, we are wired for connection and we seek belonging. And if we're told that connection and belonging are contingent upon behaving a certain way, you know, towing the line, it makes sense why we would do that. And so I think normalizing that is really important, right? But I think that we have to look to our own lived experience too. And my lived experience of enacting the diet culture and being what I thought other people wanted me to be was that I was very unhappy. And I was always looking to substances or behaviors to change how I felt. And they never worked for long, you know? And so I think it was this sort of key moment of realizing, like, hey, maybe those cocktails that are supposed to be enhancing your quality of life might actually be taking away from your quality of life. And I sort of poked a hole. It was like the Truman Show, the Truman Show, where it's like, it's all a big commercial. It sort of like poked a hole in the show, and started to get me thinking, like, maybe I'm not such an idiot after all. Maybe I actually know what I need. Maybe I actually can interpret what's going on in this moment. Maybe if I were to eat the thing that I prefer and that gives me satisfaction, then I would leave the meal in a better place and with a better mindset than if I were to eat the thing that gives me no satisfaction and supposedly, fits somebody else's prescription, So I think intuitive eating and meditation gives us the opportunity to collect the data of our own lived experience of, like, okay, so yeah, you've tried that approach. What has that done for you? Are you there yet? Are you over the rainbow yet? Or is there always more to be done, right? Because with the body, there's always more to be done. And if we're lucky, we're just going to get older and things are going to start to go downhill, right? So, there will definitely be more and more to be done if that's the goal, if perfecting the shell is the goal, right? But ultimately, there's like a tipping point where you collect enough data that you have like a library of evidence that you can trust your body, and that the people who know, quote unquote, don't know because they're not in your body, And then maybe you find your people, maybe you find other people doing similar things. And so maybe the powers that be are still pushing their products and services, but there's an undercurrent kind of brewing of people who are pushing back and who are like, I'm not going to pay for that, and then suddenly you start to see, diverse bodies modeling clothing, and you start to see families that look different from yours or that look very much like yours for a change in the media, somebody DM'd me to say that when they were looking up my book on Amazon, the first sponsored link was a diet book. I was like, I'm not surprised, but I also know that with every purchase or even click on a non-diet thing and every unclicked diet thing, the tide turns. So, writing the review of intuitive eating, writing the rating all, there are so many great anti-diet books and fat liberation books and just body liberation books. More and more are coming out all the time, And so I think that that's evidence of a wave, and we as individuals can help that through, our clicks, our purchases, our eyes, what we're willing to consume. That does shift things.
Absolutely. And speaking of books, Jenna, can you tell us about your book and where people can find you and your amazing book?
Sure. It's called Intuitive Eating for Life. And I mean that. I hope that it's the practice that you do for the rest of your life. I mean, it's sold like everything else on Amazon, but you can also get it through, there's some links on my website, jennahollenstein.com, that's like indie bookstores, where you can get it directly from the publisher, New Harbinger. And actually, there will be an audiobook coming out.
Yes,
But
good.
it's not read by me. But the good news is it is read by the person who read Linda Lovelace's memoir.
Oh my God. That's amazing.
So
That
there's a
makes me
silver
want to
lining
buy
to
it
that.
more,
So yeah, but all my information is on my website, or you can sign up for a newsletter. I send out like a video every week. Just really want to make this practice available regardless of finances and other barriers to access.
actually. And you do, Jenna. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I knew I would learn a lot, but you've actually got me to feel a lot. There are a few moments where some stuff happened. There are a couple of moments. I'm going to go back and listen to this again. But the one that really stood out was when you said, we have this innate goodness and we are born that way. And that just, oh God, it's just, yeah, I'll need to
It's an
process
exhale
that a
moment,
bit.
right? It's like, oh,
Yeah,
that's relief.
it's a relief.
Mm.
Relief. And yeah, reading your book is just so many of those moments of, it's like an exhale, big exhale. So I'm sure anyone who listens to this podcast is gonna want to find you. So thank you for sharing your incredible insights and your wisdom. And I can't wait to get the audiobook as well.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure.